Taiwo Owatemi.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The tragedy of the Grenfell Tower fire exposed serious failures concerning fire and building safety, and I echo my colleagues' concerns that 4 years after this devastating event, the government still has not learned all the fundamental lessons. My chief concern is that this bill makes absolutely no provisions which prevent existing and new buildings are under 18 metres for using the same flammable cladding materials that were used on the Grenfell Tower. And the 18 metres is roughly about 6 stories high. So if this bill passes in its current form, any building under 6 stories would be able to use dangerous flammable cladding that would wreak devastation upon its occupants if there were a fire. Now, in my constituency of Coventry North West, most new homes would not be protected from fires caused by unsafe building materials. Most school buildings would not be protected. Most care home buildings would not be protected. And most small businesses would not be protected. And all that the government has chosen to do is advise that dangerous, highly flammable materials be removed from these buildings. But as I'm sure that we are all aware, government guidance without any legal backing or funding is completely toothless. And so I urge the government to reclassify all buildings with dangerous cladding as high risk, not just the high-rise buildings in our big cities. This bill also does not go far, does far too little to protect leaseholders from the financial burden of making their homes safe. Members and right honourable members have repeatedly asked the government to draft protections for leaseholders caught up in the cladding scandal. And just last year, the Prime Minister himself stated that he is determined no leaseholders would have to pay the unaffordable cost of fixing safety defects they did not cause. So I ask, where is that determination today? Despite years of promises and reassurances from this government, they have not done nearly far enough to protect leaseholders. Instead, actually, they've done quite the opposite. The government, for example, has pointed triumphantly to its policy of extending a period a leaseholder can sue for wrongful cost under the Defective Premises Act from 6 to 15 years. However, under the National Audit Office published a report last year which stated that the government acknowledged that only in a minority of cases would it be financially justifiable to bring legal actions to recover money. In other words, the government has already acknowledged that this new policy, supposedly designed to protect leaseholders, will protect almost nobody and make almost no difference. And so I asked the government to put its money where its mouth. I asked the government to put their money where their mouth and to protect leaseholders from footing a bill that they have unfairly inherited. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Thank you very much. Fleur Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I rise today on behalf of every leaseholder in Putney, Roehampton and Southfields who's living in an unsafe building, paying the price for irresponsibility and incompetence of others, and feeling left down by the government and by this bill, which is so late and so flawed. I stand here on behalf of the Riverside Quarter, the Swish Building, the Filaments Development, the Radial Development, Hardwick Square, Whitelands Park, Mill Court, Norstead Place, and the rest of the 25 developments in Putney and Southfields in my constituency, currently on the wrong side of the building safety scandal. I stand here on behalf of those lives that have already been ruined, and for those lives that will be ruined in the future unless the government gets this bill right. Dreams of home ownership have turned into an absolute nightmare. People are furious in my constituency. I've met with so many of them. The way that the victims, and they are victims, have been treated is a disgrace. There's one block in Wandsworth which has unsafe cladding, but it's been turned down from the Building Safety Fund, and each leaseholder is now facing a £37,000 bill for remediation for the cladding. But what will this bill do for them? Behind the speeches, the briefings and the legislative noise are millions of leaseholders trapped in unsafe homes, suffering unimaginable stress, anxiety and emotional anguish, who feel and still feel totally abandoned. And the Building Safety Fund is a mess. Just 12 pence of every pound of that fund has been allocated. At this rate, it will take up to 2027 to allocate the fund, and meanwhile, people are living in fear. I recently asked the government how many applications they've received for the Building Safety Fund, Mr Deputy Speaker. A simple question, and the answer was, it will not be possible to answer this question within the usual time period. They don't know how many applications have been received, and yet applications are being serviced on a first-come, first-served basis. This bill is a step in the right direction, but it's very late, and there need to be some serious changes. The government needs to take much more of a role in this. They need to take action to stop the ever-increasing waking watch, insurance premiums and services charges resulting from building safety mismanagement. There need to be no more costs and no building safety charge, which is in this bill. There need to be explicit legal protection to ensure that all leaseholders in unsafe buildings, regardless of height, no 18-metre rule, will not have to pay for the remedial works. This bill should not be so reliant on residents having to take up legal action to get their building to be safe. It's too high a barrier to result in the changes needed. There will be inequality and it will leave unsafe buildings saying unsafe. The Building Safety Fund must be increased. Applications must be based on fire safety risk rather than first come, first served, and speeded up. And we must learn, as other members have said, from the Victorian Government example of the building and have a buildings works agency. My leaseholders should read this future bill and see that it's not having such a devastating effect on so many people's lives and makes future buildings safe as well. Thank you.
Link. Paul Blomfield.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The debate on this bill is framed by the promise that the Prime Minister made in February that, quote, no leaseholder should have to pay for the unaffordable costs of fixing safety defects that they did not cause and are no fault of their own. Now, let's dissect that pledge. There were no conditions on the height of property, none on when it was built, no limit to the nature of those defects either. The Prime Minister was right to make the pledge because, along with the developers who built them, those who live in these unsafe properties have been let down by comprehensive regulatory failure. The failure of successive governments and, as the Prime Minister said, no fault of leaseholders. So government is responsible for the problem and must take responsibility for resolving it, which this bill does not. Throughout the crisis, I've met regularly with leaseholders affected across my constituency, and I pay tribute to Sheffield Cladding Action Group, which has done so much to raise their concerns. I met with them shortly after the Fire Safety Bill was passed without amendment. They were understandably upset that it didn't put an end to their misery. But they looked to the Building Safety Bill for a solution because the Building Safety Minister and other ministers had said it would be this bill that would offer the, quote, correct legislative approach to fulfil the Prime Minister's pledge. But clearly it doesn't. Since the publication of the bill, constituents have been in touch to point out how little it does to protect them from historic costs. They've said that making it a legal requirement for building owners to exhaust, quotes, all other avenues before passing on costs fails them too, giving building owners a free pass to avoid costs so long as they found an excuse. Most of the problems they face include issues other than cladding, part of the Prime Minister's promise but not covered by the bill. Extending the right to sue developers to 15 years doesn't help many of my constituents whose homes were built earlier, like the one who pointed out to me that he was 14 years old when his building was completed. Those who will get the opportunity to pursue developers say the government knows it isn't a real option for most leaseholders. How can they take on the legal costs and, with their resources already depleted by all the bills they faced, tackle the corporate lawyers of the major developers? What of the companies that have been wound up? Let's remember the reason for this bill. It's not just that lives are being destroyed, although they are, that people have been bankrupted, although they are. Thousands of buildings have been found to be unsafe. By putting unaffordable costs on thousands of leaseholders, they will remain unsafe. The government must face up to its responsibility, make buildings safe, and then use the full resources of the state to recover the costs from those responsible. If they will not do so willingly, this Parliament needs to force them to do so by amending the bill over the weeks ahead.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I welcome that the UK Government has accepted all of the findings and recommendations of the independent review of building regulations and fire safety, and I'm glad to see the bill establish the Health and Safety Executive as a new building safety regulator and a more stringent regulatory regime for higher risk residential blocks, though I would draw the UK Government's attention to the recommendations of Zurich Insurance, who notes that limiting the scope for regulation to just those blocks risks missing a generational chance to improve the building regulation environment overall. To ensure that tragic disasters such as Grenfell never befall us again, we need a culture change in the building industry with clearer lines of accountability and responsibility. A more responsible building industry at all levels, from design through to construction, management and refurbishment. I will focus on specific aspects of where greater responsibility is needed and where the bill does not go far enough, the construction product testing process. In the bill, we find a much-needed renewed focus on construction products and their regulation and testing, as had been signalled by the Hackett report. The aim of the draft bill to create a statutory list of defined safety-critical products is welcome, but it should also be accompanied by an associated examination of safety-critical applications and safety-critical product systems. The Hackett report criticised the product testing and marketing regime for being too opaque, which could be resolved by making the results of some product tests publicly available. A system of reliable third-party certification and accreditation for those performing construction product testing would also go a long way to ensuring greater trust in the system and prevent the risk of testing being carried out by those not competent to do so. This third-party certification should benefit from an extensive oversight process, including an impartiality committee at the national level to ensure an even playing field and even application of certification across schemes. This bill takes important steps to at last make the changes to building regulation that we have long awaited since Grenfell, though it is also important to note that many of the changes stipulated by the bill will take until the year 2023 to take effect. A delay of frustrating length to these much-needed reforms. I hope that the Government continues to engage, Mr Deputy Speaker, with the APPG on fire safety and rescue, of which I am a member, with the aim of ensuring a future regulatory regime that is efficient, gives residents a greater voice and enjoys the trust of communities and industry alike. Thank you.
Video link. Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I really appreciate the opportunity of speaking in this most important debate today. Time and again, we have heard members across this House relay the nightmares that hundreds of thousands of our constituents are facing, trapped in this building safety crisis that was not of their making, forced to pay astronomical bills, suffering significant mental health problems, and the ever-present fear of living in an unsafe home. In Liverpool, 10% of buildings are still covered in dangerous cladding, and there are 30,000 leaseholders in Liverpool Riverside that are facing bills other than cladding to make their homes safe. On top of this, they are facing increasing insurance premiums up to 500% and being forced to foot the bill for a situation that they did not create. This will have a particularly serious impact on the social housing sector, with councils and local authorities forced to divert scarce resources to addressing fire safety failures. Merseyside Fire and Rescue Service has lost over a third of its funding in the past decade, and the same proportion of their firefighters. And a decade of Tory austerity and deregulation has created this building safety crisis. Call it what it is: a criminal dereliction of responsibility by those in power, more concerned with putting money in the pockets of their developer donors than with protecting the people they serve, putting profit before people. One pensioner living in my constituency told me he has been sent a bill of nearly £20,000 and has no savings and no way of paying. And two doctors who have worked tirelessly to protect and care for our communities throughout the pandemic tell me the crisis has trapped them in a flat they cannot sell, unable to start the life that they had planned elsewhere, and fearing being faced with a mountain of further debt and or bankruptcy. And I've asked this before, and I'll continue to ask until justice is served and the safety and future of my constituents and people living in this crisis across the country is secured. So can the Minister look me in the eye and tell me how he sleeps at night, knowing that your government's deregulation programme has left hundreds of thousands at risk in their homes. And I ask him, what will it take for this government to take action to fix historic failures and alleviate the unbearable financial pressures caused by their deregulation and the greed of developers? It is the responsibility of the government to assess and identify the buildings that are unsafe and to make the necessary changes with the utmost urgency. This bill is not only a missed opportunity, it's an absolute betrayal of every single resident at risk now in their own homes. The statement issued by the Secretary of State this afternoon does nothing to allay any fears of leaseholders. It is entirely inadequate and lets down leaseholders. So, Mr. Speaker, thank you.
Thank you very much. Next video link, John McDonnell.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. In the last elements of this debate, maybe I can provide some time for the words from one of my constituents. Let me just read the latest letter I've had. It says, the impact of the fire safety scandal on leaseholders' mental health is considerably underestimated by the government. From the many messages on Twitter and Facebook, there are millions of devastated lives and souls in the country. Many families and young adults had to live through not just the pandemic during the last 18 months, but also the added anxiety of the unfolding and ever-growing fire safety scandal. It's a triple hit for so many leaseholders. The pandemic, then losing jobs or being furloughed on smaller salaries, with the constant threat of losing jobs if their employer would go bust, and then the ever-increasing costs of the cladding scandal. This government has totally ignored the cries for help of its citizens. And knowing that there's a ready solution of this issue in Australia, which could easily be adopted in the UK as well, shows that the government is simply not interested in fixing the problem for innocent leaseholders. The contempt with which they treat their citizens is truly shambolic. That came from one of my constituents this week. I think it reflects the views of hundreds of them. The Minister mentioned when he opened this debate, Ballymore. I'm dealing with Ballymore. I've dealt with Ballymore from when they first put their planning application to build apartment blocks in my constituency. And I welcome the developments that would provide homes for local residents. But not a single planning gain that they promised has been delivered. They went bust and then they got bailed out by the Irish government. Since then, and since this scandal has hit us, first of all, they refused to meet and seriously discuss with local residents the problems that they face. My constituents then demonstrated, so Ballymore is now meeting with them and having proper discussions, but threatened them that if they demonstrated again, they would end the talks. Now what they've done is they've applied for the Building Safety Fund, but they will not give any assurances that they will cover the full costs of what my constituents are facing until they know about the Building Safety Fund resources available to them. This continuous blackmail and emotional blackmail of my constituents, which is just unacceptable. And as the email I received from my constituents, it's having a direct impact on their mental health. We're facing a pandemic of mental health problems because of the COVID crisis, but this adds to it. It needs government intervention, which is serious, takes responsibility, but then pursues the developers to ensure that they are held accountable as well. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Very much. And because it's almost Christmas, Jim, we're going to give you a bonus minute. 4 minutes, I know. Jim Shannon.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, you're most kind, and thank you so much for that. By the way, I'll share it with anybody who wants an intervention. Okay, there we are. Can I say I'm very pleased to speak in this. To be number 53 in the list, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and to get in is quite an occasion. Yesterday I sat for 2 days at number 53 to get speaking the second day, so here we've done it all in one day, so I'm very, very pleased. I spoke on this topic not so long ago. And I'm proud to be here to speak briefly on its second reading. I welcome government's commitment in the Secretary of State and discussions we've had, and also with the Honourable Member and Minister here tonight as well, who I know personally and who I value his friendship in relation to. So I'm very pleased to see the issues of safety that government is making an honest to goodness attempt to try and address those issues. Others have referred to to some of the things that haven't been done. They don't see them in this legislation, and I find that quite unfortunate. I'm going to make some comments about electrical safety. The Honourable lady just remember, for North Ayrshire and Arran, and I have a particular interest in electrical safety. I know it's something that we both speak on whenever the occasion arrives. This necessary piece of legislation that needs proper scrutiny and time to be debated, as people's lives depend on the content of this bill. The Building Safety Bill is, I believe, a real opportunity to protect lives and property by reducing the number of fires caused by electrical sources of ignition in HRRBs. Clauses regarding electricity safety have been removed from the bill. I spoke to the Secretary about this here. He did tell me that he wasn't aware of this issue, so again I ask it as a question of the Minister. Could he just maybe reassure me that those clauses have not been removed, or if they have been removed, that safety is paramount and it won't be in any way be affected. The Building Safety Bill allows for a new regulator which aims to implement a new scheme for high-risk buildings, oversees performance and sustainability of all building controls, and supports the competence of those working in the industry, which is crucial, as confidence could be knocked from previous tragedies. One crucial element of this bill that needs to be reinforced is a resident engagement strategy, which aims to educate residents and make them accountable for the complaints action. I think anything that improves the cooperation and the partnership and the relationship between a tenant or an owner and the landlord is something that we would always wish to see happening. This makes them aware of the risks and allows for communication between builders, contractors and residents. This is not perfect, it's far from it, Mr Deputy Speaker, but we do hope it tonight can move us a stage further to making it better. Electrical Safety First charity is worthy of a mention as it highlights the importance of sustainable electrical safety. In England, 54% of all electrical dwelling fires are caused by an electrical source of ignition. These include the Grenfell, Shirley Towers in Southampton and Shepherd's Court in London as 3 examples. These tragic events have the fatal risk electrical incidents posed to people in their own homes. More time committed to prevention of electrical fires. I'm very keen to ensure that government moves in the correct way and ensures that we do see ourselves coming to a position where we can make this happen. The issue with external buildings and also safety precautions need to be addressed by the government regarding internal building issues such as damp, mould, efficient air conditioning. The Shadow Minister and myself have spoken on this on a number of occasions. I'm chair of the APPT on Healthy Homes and Buildings. The issue of air conditioning, of addressing the issue of mould and damp in houses is so important. We should take all necessary and reasonable precautions to ensure homes, buildings are safe for families and people. And I finish with this, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Building Safety Bill will introduce a much needed overhaul of building changes, including the revamping of flammable cladding, the investigation of inappropriate materials, a central safety-led approach, and despite the challenges of the pandemic, progress has been made to accelerate building safety measures, and I wholeheartedly welcome this step to improve building standards. Mr Deputy Speaker, thank you so much, and thanks for the Christmas present as well.
To Jim.
My apologies, I didn't realise it.
The wind-ups. Mike Amesbury.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And it's an honour and a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for Stranraer. I think I'm 54th on the list. So yes. First and foremost, I want to thank nearly every member from all sides of the chamber who've spoken powerfully and with insight in this second reading debate on the Building Safety Bill. I do want to put on record that I found the intervention with the last-minute statement both discourteous and disrespectful to all sides of the House. And it's a point which has been reiterated as a point of order, and the Madam Deputy Speaker obviously raised those concerns as well. As my honourable friend and the Shadow Secretary of State for Housing both eloquently and powerfully argued, this is an occasion that requires the best of all parliamentarians to put any vested interests aside and step up to urgently respond to the building safety crisis. Our concerns are focused on what is not in the bill rather than the new regulation landscape it creates for building safety going forward, with the building safety regulator, the new housing ombudsman, the improved standards, which are all very welcome and certainly we will support and sometimes in cases may amend as we go forward in terms of the journey of the bill. Mr Deputy Speaker, this approach requires the executive, the government ministers before me, now not only to listen to the opposition, but also on those benches opposite that are growing in number. That requires ministers to listen to all stakeholders who will provide evidence throughout the bill's journey over the coming months in both this House and the other place. We all have a shared goal to provide a voice and justice to the millions of leaseholders and residents across all our shores and make buildings and vitally people safe over 4 years on from Grenfell when 72 people tragically lost their lives. Leaseholders such as Will from UK Cladding Action, who spoke very recently on the TV about the many complexities of his personal experience of the building safety crisis and the impact the measures contained in the current bill will have to change that. He referred to the pressures in terms of mental health, indeed eloquently raised by the Honourable Member for Hayes and Harlington in regards to his constituents. Key questions to ask. Does this bill help Will from UK Cladding Action as a leaseholder pay an invoice which has recently arrived through his letterbox for £30,000? The Honourable Member of Salford Eccles spoke about constituents in her patch which have just had bills for £100,000. And unfortunately the plain answer is no. And will it deal with the horrendous and astronomical rise in insurance premiums that members across this chamber have highlighted in today's second reading? And again, the answer is an unequivocal no. Will it change the size and scope of the Building Safety Fund to help constituents in places like the Decks, in my honourable friend's constituency in Holton, the Runcorn part of Holton, where one part of the development is below 18 metres but still at risk, containing in all the toxicity that we know is the building safety crisis, and the other is above 18 metres, and this definitely won't help the likes of Julie and those constituents in Runcorn. In fact, Mr Deputy Speaker, speech after speech, case after case, from the 42 members that actually gotten to speak today have shone a light on the open and painful wounds of what is missing from this bill. Let's give some examples. The Honourable Member for Hackney South and Shoreditch highlighted the dreadful impact of the EWS1 system is still having. Flats rated 0, unsettleable, unmortgageable. And today, at the very last minute, we get a written statement claiming that it's going to change that marketplace. In fact, lots of the content seems to be recycled and reproduced in terms of a statement that was spun some months ago. But I will ask the Minister a number of questions there. Is the guidance note that was issued in January 2020 going to be withdrawn? It's essential that it is. Is it going to be legislated for? Are those buildings below 18 metres that now seemingly don't require an EWS 1 form, do they have to have cladding removed? Do they have to have remediation for all the other, whether it's missing fire breaks, whether it's the inappropriate construction, using timber, as some of the honourable friends across the way have mentioned? We need answers to those questions. Very important, the leaseholders need answers to those questions. The honourable member some honourable members referred to a black hole of the Building Safety Fund, an application process that's tantamount, as Martin, who certainly the father of the house knows very well from the excellent leaseholder knowledge partnership, referred to like knitting fog. Indeed, Inside Housing today highlights a case where a building in Wandsworth that meets the height threshold has been rejected by the fund. So I urge the Minister today to correct this wrong. And why not, while the Minister's at it and the team, make sure that more than 12p in every pound is getting out of the door in terms of that fund. The chair of the Select Committee has made a strong and consistent point about the need to include social housing providers within the scope of the fund, a point echoed by the Local Government Association and the National Housing Federation. Mr Deputy Speaker, the much trumpeted £5.1 billion figure for cladding remediation would not have come about if it wasn't for those brilliant campaigners that have made up what is called the End Our Cladding Scandal campaign. Campaigners that are not going to be ground down, that are not going to be quiet in their quest for justice. There were 17 promises made by ministers, including the Prime Minister, that they would not have to pay historical remediation charges. A promise that has not come to fruition in the 217 pages of this bill. We are also yet to see the details of the unwanted loan scheme that has failed in Victoria, Australia, let alone a bold and just polluter pays approach directed at many of the government's friends and donors in the big developer community. Mr Deputy Speaker, the Secretary of State, in opening this debate, referred to clause 124 of this new bill, purporting to amend the Landlords and Tenants Act 1985 to protect leaseholders from costs of historical defective work, a point highlighted by the Father of the House. It simply reasserts the status quo of requiring the landlord to pursue insurance, public grant and warranty claims that have not worked so far. Like much of this bill, it makes reference to secondary legislation to follow. No details, no protection for leaseholders. The Secretary of State also referred to the inclusion of Section 38 of the Building Act 1984 and the retrospective changes to the Defective Premises Act 1972, a legal remedy to bring an extension from 6 to 15 years, the right to bring actions against developers responsible for shoddy building work. Sounds great in theory, but can the Minister highlight how many times this David and Goliath approach has been successful under the current 6-year regime? Can he also advise the House how leaseholders pursue the special delivery project vehicles set up and closed down by developers, or where you get the millions of pounds to pursue claims, and how those counterclaims, how long those counterclaims will take by developers under human rights legislation that will follow? Mr Deputy Speaker, it seems that the ministers have designed a job creation scheme for lawyers, a frenzy of litigation and further delay. Mr Deputy Speaker, as my honourable friend, the Housing Secretary, asserted, we need a cast iron legal guarantee to protect leaseholders from historical remediation costs, and we will be working on a cross-party basis for amendments to achieve just that. Secondly, and finally, we're calling for the establishment of an interventionist building works agency, not dissimilar to Victoria, Australia, to get a grip of the crisis from assessment of risk, from building to building, from start to finish, with a crack team of experts in this field. Find, fund, fix and recover with a polluter pays principle. The hundreds of thousands of leaseholders trapped in this living nightmare deserve nothing less, and they require all the willing to step up and do the right thing. And let's make good law together beyond this second reading.
BD Link. Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. This is the first and I trust the last time that I'll have to speak from the virtual dispatch box, but I'm afraid that self-isolation rules allow me no other option. But I'd like to begin by thanking all right honourable and honourable members across the House for their contributions to this debate. I know it's a highly emotive subject, and understandably so. I particularly want to pay tribute to the contributions from my honourable friends, the members for Blackpool North, Harrow East, Bolton North East, Waveney, of course Kensington, Dudley North, my right honourable friend, the member for Basingstoke, and the Father of the House for their thoughtful contributions. Mercifully, as my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, said in his introduction to the debate, the spread of fire in high-rise buildings is rare, and it's becoming more rare. But as he also made clear in his speech, it's all too clear what can happen when those responsible for designing, building and managing those buildings fail. Tragedies like Grenfell can happen. And that's why it's this government's absolute priority to make sure that a tragedy like that never happens again. And I think the contributions from across the House firmly reiterate just how important it is to pass this bill to restore confidence in residents for their own safety and confidence in the wider housing market. Safety is our paramount concern, and I certainly want to assure the honourable member for Strangford that that is the case. We see this as a landmark bill. It represents the greatest improvement to building and fire safety in a generation. It's flagship legislation that will spearhead our wider safety programme to ensure the proportionate management of risk in buildings. It's a bill that will require building owners to manage safety risks to the same high standards as the best do, where there are clear safety responsibilities for those responsible for the design, the construction, the completion and the occupation of high-rise buildings, where they must demonstrate that they have effective and proportionate measures in place to meet those responsibilities, and where they are accountable to the regulator and to their residents. Now, a number of colleagues across the House have made some very important points, and in the short time I have, I'd like to try to address a number of them. The first is proportionality, something which was discussed by my honourable friends, the members for Southampton Itchen, for Bassetlaw, for Orpington, to name three. It is hugely important that we take a proportionate approach to the safety of tall buildings and all buildings. The industry must take note, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Risk aversion is causing unnecessary financial burdens to homeowners. Remediation works should only ever be undertaken where absolutely necessary. We mustn't spend taxpayers' money where it's unnecessary to spend it, or ask hard-pressed leaseholders to pay for works that don't need to be done. And our bill takes a proportionate approach. It rightly focuses on mitigating and managing risk and targeting activity only where action is needed. The new building safety regulator is being established in the Health and Safety Executive precisely because of its experience overseeing safety case regimes and its record of delivering robust yet proportionate regulation. And the requirements of the bill help ensure that proportionality is embedded in its operations. Building owners and managers, along with lenders and insurers, need to ensure that they too all take a proportionate approach to risk in blocks of flats, whatever the height. And in line with the expert evidence that we've published today, EWS1 forms should not be a requirement on buildings below 18 metres. Low-rise blocks should not need them, and lenders should not ask for them. And the consolidated advice note, which was born out of the need for safety information in the aftermath of the Grenfell fire, will now be retired. And any concerns that do exist about existing buildings should be addressed primarily through risk management and mitigation. Because for many thousands of people, the computer says no approach to risk and valuation has been hugely unfair, hugely distressing. It must become much more proportionate. That is what our measures are intended to do, to get the market moving again, as my honourable friend, the member for Beaconsfield, called. And I hope that these measures will also address some of the concerns that were raised by my right honourable friend, the member for Hemel Hempstead. I want also to assure Mr Deputy Speaker, the House, that this bill in no way absolves the responsibility of the sector for paying its way. Indeed, it'll place more and greater duties and responsibilities on developers, construction companies, building owners and managers than ever before, embedding the principles of safe design and construction right from a building's inception. And the new regulator will have the skills and resources to pursue those who refuse to meet their responsibilities. We'll strengthen criminal penalties throughout the bill, making offences imprisonable for up to 2 years and making directors and managers criminally liable if they decide that their companies should act unlawfully. Those who can pay must pay. And through the bill, we will further cement developers' contributions to the cost of remediation, as well as increase the ability of building owners and leaseholders to seek redress. Specifically, Part 3 of the bill contains a provision to introduce a levy which will apply to high-rise residential buildings and will be paid by developers, which complements the residential property development tax that the Chancellor will bring forward. And together, these will contribute more than £2 billion for remediation. Mr Deputy Speaker, I also want to respond to concerns raised by members, including my honourable friend, the member for Bolton North East, regarding the right of homeowners to seek redress. The bill will give millions of homeowners new rights to seek redress for shoddy workmanship, extending the period during which they can claim from 6 to 15 years. It'll empower building owners, leaseholders and homeowners to take legal action, clamping down on rogue developers and their owners. And I urge all who've fallen victim to shoddy work to use this newly extended liability period to consider whether litigation is right for them and to explore who is best or which group of them is best to take action. And I trust it will also encourage developers and freeholders aware of the new additional rights of their customers to act responsibly and quickly to deal with concerns before they reach the courts. And as well as redress, the bill will also provide residents with a greater voice, strengthening the voice of residents and leaseholders through a statutory residents panel, whilst a formal complaints process will give residents the confidence to raise issues and escalate where they're needed, including to the building safety regulator. I'm conscious, Mr Deputy Speaker, that it is nearly 7 o'clock. I'm conscious too that there will be plenty of opportunity in other debates in the House, in committee stage and report stage, to debate the government's proposals further. So let me conclude by saying that we are leaving no stone unturned in our pursuit of a regime that is both proportionate and comprehensive. We've tested, we've consulted, we've analysed, and we've done it all at considerable length. And we've now produced a bill that I believe we should all support. A bill that will confront the building safety issues that no government has dared to tackle before. A bill that will force industry to take collective responsibility for the safety defects they've created, and support a changing culture so that residents' concerns are listened to, problems are identified, dealt with early, and tragedies like Grenfell never happen again. I want to thank everyone that's taken part in this debate, all those that have contributed to the development of this bill, and I commend it to the House.